or whatever, getting answers from you as to, whatever you know. I know attending the Q&As, there's still a lot of information out there that people don't know. And so we are waiting to hear in terms of some bills that have gone in and whether or not they're even likely to come out. Have you heard anything in terms of extending the start date or minimum population?
I know that both of those topics are before the legislature right now, and honestly, your guess is as good as mine about what will finally come out. It's part of, that sausage making process that we talk about. One of the proposals is to push off the effective date until January 1 of 2024. There's another that would push it off until July 1 of 2025. There is a proposal, although from what I hear, it really doesn't have legs, that would have exempted towns under 10,000 residents from compliance with LD 2003 completely. And there's also another bill, which we can get into talking about shoreland areas. There's some special treatment for shoreland zoning, or at least a carve out. You've probably seen throughout LD 2003, there's a proposal that essentially would extend sort of the density allowances and ADU allowances to shoreland areas as well. But from a practical standpoint, unfortunately, I'm going ahead with the assumption that come July 1, what we see now is going to be the law. And hopefully, it would certainly be nice. I think you're now the 5th client town that I've worked with on amendments to their land use ordinances, all of them under 10,000 people, by the way. It would be nice to have a little bit of additional time to allow people to really deal with these issues. But I think the legislature seems to be of the opinion that we have a pressing housing issue, which isn't incorrect necessarily, and that, kicking the can down the road isn't going to help with the issue at all. So to your question, I think it's unfortunately a bit of a wait and see approach. I'm not aware that any of those amendments or changes are imminent, but we continue to pay attention to them as best we can.
I did notice, I did finally find the one regarding extending it to July 1st, 2025 for startup, and it said went out of committee not to,
right,
whatever the initials are.
Yeah, ought not to pass. Right. Yep. Which effectively kills it. It's possible some ways through magic, I guess, to revive a bill like that, but that's not usually a very good sign of it becoming law.
Okay. All right.
I have the January 1st, 24 date, according to the DECD people, was for towns who had a town council. And if we don't, so we're going to be, if it were to be postponed for Islesboro, according to people I just got off the Zoom with, it would be July the 1st of 24.
Right.
If it were to be postponed.
That makes more sense.
They specifically said those two dates were differentiated by the way your town government is run. Okay.
Right, and that makes practical sense, because again, it takes a lot more effort to get something before town meeting than it does to simply put it on a council agenda. So I noticed Jennifer was kind enough to send along sort of a draft that you're working through on the ADU issue. I'm happy to proceed whatever way that whatever you'd like, whatever you think would be the most helpful. I can talk. It sounds as if all of you are pretty well familiar with the aspects of the law. Sometimes I have to start from the beginning and sort of explain exactly what LD 2003 is attempting to fix and how it's proposing to do that. But excuse me. it doesn't seem as if I really need to go through that type of education. So let me know if you would like to hear my spiel, but otherwise I'm happy to talk about whatever specific questions you have.
Well, I was thinking that particularly, we need to have you, while we have you go through all three of them. The affordable housing density honestly seemed a very difficult one. Well, we'll have to set up a new ordinance. And it will have to, I would assume, go into our chapter 45 development review section. And in addition, maybe to land use, I'm not quite sure how it goes, but affordable housing is way outside my bailiwick. And actually Rick Rogers is the head of our Islesboro Affordable Properties Group. And he was just talking to Hillary and Ben at DECD regarding things. So maybe, do you have any particular questions, Rick? Ask them now.
No, I spoke to them for about an hour and a half. Clearly, they know exactly what the law says, and that's what they're there to do, is to try and explain to lay people like us what the state really means. And unfortunately, all the little hair splittings I was trying to do didn't seem to work out in the favor of IAP. So I've got another email out to them trying to get some clarification about a couple of things, but you know, probably the killer was with the affordable housing density, it only applies in designated development areas, which none of the properties IAP owns are in. And it also has to be attached to some sort of municipal sewer and water system, which
that way too.
the only place that exists is down in Dark Harbor. So, you know, it really, it's gonna be very difficult to use, as far as I could tell so far, the density bonuses here on Islesboro for affordable property. I actually went down the road of ADUs because in the state law, it doesn't have any maximum size for ADU, but in our local ordinance, unless that's changed since I just printed out 15 minutes ago, it's still 800 square feet as a maximum. So, you know, none of those things are really working out the way I would like for them to be, but that, you know, that's the way it is. That was pretty much the discussion around the Reader's Digest version around the density bonus for affordable housing.
Okay. So maybe Ben, you could clarify, or did you have more questions?
Well, yeah, Ben suggested that some of us might, or he suggested he could just give us a quick précis of what the intent is here. I would have thought that every planning board would have received some information besides the boilerplate that gave a précis or a rundown on the intent and how they, you know, how the state expects to perfect the intent and all that sort of thing. And I'm sort of blind about that, because I'm not sure just what how the state started and what the intent is. I mean, I know the basic intent, but not what got into this boilerplate. So I would appreciate it if you could give us a 5-minute sermonette on just how we got to where we are. And put it into context, in other words.
Sure. Well,
Right.
you're not alone in having those concerns, so you're not missing anything necessarily. The DECD has in a couple of weeks ago released administrative regulations, which are meant to elucidate, I guess, some areas of the law. I frankly don't think they do much more than what the statute already tells you. But you know, the overall theme of this legislation, you have to remember that this started as a task force, as like a select committee. It was established, I think, about 3 or 4 years ago by the legislature, and they were tasked with coming up with a whole set of ideas of how to proliferate affordable housing and just housing in general in Maine, because I think anybody you ask knows full well that we have a shortage, and that creates a lot of downstream problems. So, you know, the group met over the course of, I think, a year to 18 months and ultimately came up with a set of proposals for the legislature, who codified them into in part what LD 2003 is today. This is just the first step. You know, I don't mean to be a fearmonger necessarily, but there will be amendments to LD 2003. There will probably be different bills coming down in the future. You know, we'll know better how to react to them in the future, I suppose. But I like to compare, sort of for better or worse, this to shoreline zoning in the sense that you have to keep in mind LD 2003 is an express limitation on home rule authority, which means that on July 1, unless that date is changed, anything in Islesborough's ordinances that's not consistent with LD 2003 is effectively preempted, which means that if you were to try and enforce it, that could become illegal. That could lead to legal liability for the town. Now, of course, I don't get the sense, and in most towns, it's not as if you're going to have your door battered down on July 1 with everybody who's, you know, wanting to pull permits. I think there will be some time to adapt and react. But what we have in this first step is this bill. And as you probably know, the bill is best broken and understood in three key parts. The first is affordable housing density, which I can talk about next, and just more in terms of specifics. It's meant to give a greater density bonus, a 2.5 time density bonus to housing that's either available for rent or to purchase that is going to be affordable for people of certain income levels. And we can go into the specifics, but long story short is affordable housing is generally termed to be something that only takes up 30% of your income to pay for. And affordable housing in the context of this law is it's either a rental unit that is affordable to someone who's making up to 80% of area median income, or a purchased unit that's affordable for someone making up to 120% of area median income. And that number is established by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. It is not something that comes out of thin air. It's a pretty well-researched number. And it changes, of course, depending on what part of the state you're in. So that's part one. Part two is a related topic, which is just a general allowance for more density, generally of single-family dwellings than might possibly have been allowable otherwise. The key caveat to that, though, is that the statute specifically allows Islesboro and any other town to keep your minimum lot size per dwelling unit requirements in place. And that's a pretty big, you know, we were a bit confused when we saw that part because it seems to cut against the intent of the law a little bit, but we've clarified with DECD that that was really the intent. And so in effect, in areas of town where you say X number of square feet per dwelling unit, regardless of what LD 2003 theoretically allows, if you don't have enough space on that lot to accommodate additional dwelling units, this law does not force the code officer to issue permits to that effect. The third area is accessory dwelling units, and some towns in Maine, believe it or not, Islesboro is obviously not one of them, but some towns expressly prohibit accessory dwelling units for whatever reason. And so every municipality in Maine is now going to be required to permit them on any lot where a single family home is already the principal use. There are a couple caveats to this, and there will be a couple of tweaks to your ordinances to accommodate for these. I think the most notable of them is you can't require additional parking be set aside for an ADU. There is this minimum size now of 190 square feet. But you are not prohibited from setting your own maximum size, as you've already done. There's also a requirement that you have to exempt an ADU from density requirements, which means you can't consider it a principal dwelling unit. So back to my previous point about square footage per dwelling unit, that only accounts for principal dwelling units, not for an ADU. You're not allowed to subject the ADU to greater setbacks or other greater dimensional requirements than would otherwise be applicable to the single family home. So again, very small tweaks, I think, to your ordinance in that effect. So those are the three key areas. And again, it is a one-size-fits-all approach. I think It's admirable. I think that this legislature has tried to do this. It obviously is not going to work as intended in every town in Maine, but we do the best we can. And I guess, before I get into specifics, the one thing I will say is keep in mind, this is a policy decision ultimately for the town of Islesboro and every other town, but LD 2003 sets the floor, not the ceiling. And by that, I mean, if you as a community decide that affordable housing or housing density is something that you want to encourage, there's nothing that prohibits you from being more allowing of these types of things than LD 2003 provides. You could provide for more density. You could provide for greater availability of ADUs. You could provide for a whole lot of things. Those sort of fall into your home rule authority. So I don't want to lose sight of that. But in terms of getting you ready for July 1 or whenever that drop dead date is, those are the three sort of categories that we need to be looking specifically at. So I guess the first question was really about affordable housing, and I can talk about that a little bit more. I agree. I was looking through your comprehensive plan yesterday, and that sort of it's a very important document in this conversation because I think it was, as was already pointed out, the affordable housing density bonus under LD 2003 is available for properties that meet one of two requirements, and this is an either or, it's not a both. The first is it's in a designated growth area, which you do you designate some growth areas by general characteristics in your comprehensive plan, but don't necessarily specifically list zoning districts or things like that. So one of your tasks is going to be, if you haven't done so already, is to really identify what you believe those growth areas are as identified in your comprehensive plan. Those areas are areas where this 2.5 time density bonus for affordable housing needs to be permitted. If a lot or a property is not in a growth area, it would still be eligible for this density bonus if it has both public water and public sewer. And I know Islesboro is obviously unique in this circumstance. Most of the towns I work with are small enough that that they're all on septic, they're all on wells. They have no growth areas. And so that's usually the end of that conversation with them. But because you have growth areas, and because I know that, do you have any public sewer on the island? Okay,
Yes.
so there conceivably are a small but an existing universe of properties where this affordable housing density would be required to be offered. And so what we will need to do collaboratively is effectively amend your land use ordinance to allow this type of density, given the types of requirements that are laid out in the statute.
What
And
about, look at our town centers,
mhm.
and can they be designated? I mean, can they be considered designated growth areas?
Well, it's all consistent on it. So a growth area is a term of art in a way. It is something that you're required by statute to designate in your comprehensive plan as part of your planning process, or to get an express exemption from the state because you claim, and many towns meet this, they say, look, we're a small town, we don't anticipate any significant growth in any area, and we would prefer not to designate these areas at all. So again, and I'm pulling up your comprehensive plan as we speak. It's all dependent on what your comprehensive plan says. It would be the areas that are designated in that plan as growth areas that would have this bonus available in addition to those that have public water and sewer. So for instance, I'm looking, and this is the 2017 comprehensive plan update, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's your most recent document.
Yes.
Okay. So your growth areas are designated generally as there are 3 of them. Village areas, activity center, which includes the area west of Meadow Pond Road near the transfer station. And then marine activity areas, which are, Dark Harbor, Grindle Point, Pendleton, the like. So what will need to happen is the town, what would be helpful here in either proposing or working with you on drafting language is identifying exactly, and a map would be perfect if possible, a map that shows those growth areas. Because effectively, is that it? Is that one of them?
I think these are right here.
Well, those are the town centers,
Well,
yes.
And the Up Island one was voted
Was voted
down.
down,
by
yeah.
the-
Yeah, so they're just not cited in the comprehensive plan, I guess. They didn't update the comprehensive plan maybe when they put in the town centers. Town centers is in the ordinance, the land use ordinance.
Yep. Well, let's see. That's and that's a district in and of itself, correct? It's
Yes.
125-29.1. That is one of them. I'm just, again, there's a bit of a disconnect, and we need to connect that, and we need to remove the disconnect is what I see in your most recent comprehensive plan are that growth areas are made up of what are termed village areas, the activity center, and marine activity areas. Now, what we will need to do is find a way to specifically identify what is meant there, and it'll take a little bit of work. There's a good description of those areas in the comprehensive plan update, and I can send that to Carrie to make sure we're all working on off of the same document. But the town, we're going to need to identify specifically on a map where those areas are, because one of the updates to your land use ordinance will be what I think I would probably call an affordable housing overlay district, which are these growth areas as well as the areas that have both public water and sewer, and those being the areas where this additional affordable housing density is available. So that's probably the easiest way to deal with that.
Can that be added to? Can the town add a designated growth
sure.
area?
Well, like I said, yes. I mean, you could. I'm going all the way in the opposite direction, I suppose. You could say there's nothing that prohibits a town meeting, if it wanted to, from saying we're going to allow affordable housing at a 2.5 time density anywhere that single family homes can be accommodated in Islesboro. You could just allow it as a use. I mean, there are ways, you could create an affordable housing use, which is separate from a single family use or something like that, and provide that helps. The one thing that you need to be aware of, though, is you will have areas in your comprehensive plan that are the opposite of growth areas. There are places that you've identified that you want to preserve rural character, decrease density, and the cardinal rule of any amendment to your zoning ordinance is that it has to be consistent with your comprehensive plan. So the short answer is yes, there's nothing that prevents you, as long as it's consistent with your comp plan, of offering affordable housing density in places above and beyond what LD 2003 requires of you. But we need to be careful about identifying where those are and making sure that allowing housing in that type of density is not, it's not going to be destructive of natural environment. It's not going to be inconsistent with the character of those particular parts of the town, and above all, is consistent with your comp plan.
Are these two areas that we have a map showing them that are on this wall, are those designated as growth areas? Or are they just designated for other reasons? I'm confused about that. I'm not so sure that these two maps comply with what we would have to do to call them areas that we could have increased affordable housing.
Yeah, to your question, I'm not sure, because I can't really see those maps.
Oh, all right,
Yeah,
sorry.
I know. I don't think you're gonna be able to zoom in enough. The distinction is that growth areas are, in a perfect world, and we don't live in one, obviously. In a perfect world, you adopt a comprehensive plan. And for instance, it says, in the village areas, so this designates the middle of town with the town center, near Durkee Store from Herbert's Point Road north to where Main Road splits. In a perfect world, those areas would be zoned, or you would amend your land use ordinance to accommodate increased growth in those areas. So to your point, at a minimum, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
But we haven't done that, is that correct, in our ordinance?
Well, in our
We have not
comprehensive,
designated them.
our comprehensive plan does not cite them. It sounds like our ordinance has created these special districts that allow
Opposite.
increased density.
I'm not sure of that. That's my
The
question.
inverse is actually true. So I'm reading from your comprehensive plan.
That we haven't.
Well, let me simplify things, I suppose. The areas that are designated as growth areas in your comprehensive plan, regardless of what your land use ordinance says right now, those are areas that LD 2003 requires you to permit affordable housing at that increased density. And in addition to those areas, any place that is served by public water and sewer is eligible for those bonuses as well. So what we need to do is, what would be helpful on your end is to cross-reference what is designated in the comprehensive plan as these growth areas and your public water and sewer, and figure out what areas of town, what map and lot numbers those two areas cover, because those are going to be the areas at a minimum that this affordable housing density needs to be allowed. You can expand that to other areas as we discussed, but that's the baseline that you're going to have to permit come July 1.
So that's something we can do, is that correct? From the comprehensive plan, we can identify them.
Yes.
Okay, so, all right.
But they have to be specifically identified in the comprehensive plan.
And they are.
The areas, that maybe that's our problem. I don't know.
Well,
Yes, that's where the confusion is.
Yeah, I think the one, I wouldn't call it a problem necessarily, but just, the process issue, how about that? So I don't believe that there is a perfect overlap between your growth areas and like a particular zoning district in your land use ordinance, right? So for instance, you could have a growth area that is, partially in one zoning district and partially in another. So it wouldn't be an effective way of doing this to simply say that, for instance, the town center district, although this is probably the case, is a particular zoning district where affordable housing is allowed. That's probably one of those areas, but we need to identify what other areas in town fall into these categories, because my assumption is you'll essentially have an overlay over your zoning map of those areas where affordable housing density is permitted. And then it'll reference a specific section, a new section of your land use ordinance that specifies what an affordable housing unit is, what needs to happen in order for this additional density to be allowed, so on and so forth.
That's very, very helpful, I think, because we can probably identify it going back to the comprehensive plan, as long as we stick to what the comprehensive plan was intended, we can then designate those specifically as growth areas, and that's what you're saying. But I one little caveat here. If we, just so that I think it's all on the table, if we want to have growth areas anywhere else besides, notwithstanding the sewage, we would have to go to another town meeting in order to designate them as growth areas. We cannot do that as a board. We have to have the ordinance changed by town meeting, which is in this town is a torturous process,
Comprehensive plan, and then,
right?
Well, I have bad news. The bad news is that this process is going to require town meeting approval one way or the other. Because
Yeah.
we are going to need to amend your land use ordinance and perhaps your development review ordinance as well. But to your specific question, you do not need to go and redo your comprehensive plan just to enable you to allow affordable housing in other areas of town. We can do that. Yes, we can do that through these ordinance amendments. Like I said, to the extent that it's consistent with your comp plan. So consider, we don't want to be allowing very dense development, in farmland or in other sensitive areas or areas that your comp plan says we don't want development.
Yeah.
But with that aside, I suppose, there are certainly, it's available for you to allow this affordable housing density in more places in town beyond just the growth areas, right? So you as a board need to decide what you want to recommend, and then town meeting is ultimately going to be the decider on that. Yep.
I have I guess, a couple of statements that kind of poses a question, which is, you say that they have to have public sewer and water. Well, if you're talking about potable water, I don't think there's any place on the island that has both of those. And we have a public sewer, but as far as I know, everybody in Dark Harbor is on a well. So that means that's off the table because it doesn't have both. Is that right?
So it's an either or. So keep that in mind. So it's either you're in a growth area or you have public water and sewer. Those are the
It's
two.
a growth area, but then, so I guess it still applies. And the second thing, I'm not on the planning board, never have been, but it seems to me 6 years ago, when we were talking about these town centers in the local parlance, that you're saying that in the planning board, there's an up island one around the Durkee store.
No,
I am certain that got voted down,
it got voted down.
but it's still in the plan, it's still in the,
No,
it's not, oh, okay, I thought I heard it was, okay.
It's in the comprehensive plan.
Well, it's in the comprehensive plan, but
But
that,
it's not in the ordinance.
what
Yeah, that's a
I'm
good
hearing
point.
is that the comprehensive plan controls.
Good point.
well, so we could potentially have an ordinance citing that area around that's area as having affordable housing.
And
It's
torque off the
cited.
north end of the island if you do that, because they
Yeah.
didn't vote to have it.
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense.
Well, they would still have to vote for it.
Yeah, right, we'd still have to go back through the process.
Which they wouldn't. I
Because
don't
they
think they
recognize-
can.
Yeah. Mhm.
If it's in the comprehensive plan but not in the ordinance, does the comprehensive plan, is that your question, Rick?
Well,
Does the comprehensive plan,
does it control?
control it?
Well, it depends what the specific question is. I mean, ultimately, your ordinance is the document that controls. A comprehensive plan is an aspirational document. It's not, it's not a constitution. It is not an ordinance. It doesn't replace the ordinance, but we'll have to think, we'll have to look more closely. If what I'm hearing from you is that there are areas identified as growth areas in the comp plan, where after that comp plan was adopted, the town has taken specific votes to limit development in those areas. We'll have to look at that. I mean, I think my recommendation there is that Well, for one, if there's a lack of congruence there, then your comp plan should be updated. But that, beyond that, though, I think we can look at that and we can finally tailor this overlay as what I'm envisioning it as, these areas that are truly growth areas. And I think there's probably enough to support the town in making the argument. You're a very small knit community, and so the thought of somebody coming in and saying, well, it's in your comp plan and I'm going to sue you as a result because you're not allowing me to do what you want to do is probably pretty low. But I think we can take a look and make sure that everything is accounted for. And by that, I mean, if you've taken affirmative votes to limit development in areas that are still designated growth areas, I think you've got legal backing to make the decision that those areas would not allow affordable housing at an increased density.
Great.
I know it can be a bit of a head scratcher at times. The other part of the law that we've sort of glazed over a little bit, and keep this in mind, is that there's also additional density that is available. This is not affordable housing. This is market rate housing. This is garden variety housing. And again, we've got the same two distinctions here. There's an increased density allowed in areas where there are either public water and sewer or in growth areas. And in those areas, the town needs to allow up to 4 dwelling units on raw land. And then up to 2 additional dwelling units on land that has an existing dwelling unit on it. Again, this is subject to the major caveat that I talked about before, of the fact that minimum lot size per dwelling unit targets and the like are still in place. And so to the extent that those exist in your ordinance, and I'll admit, have not done a massive deep dive into this, but I believe your ordinance does set minimum lot size per dwelling unit in some areas of town, and those would still remain in control.
So it would still be 1.5 acres per dwelling unit.
Assuming that's what it actually says. And so we need to take a look at that and make sure that that's truly the case, because we're talking minimum lot size per dwelling unit, not just minimum size to be considered a legal lot, if that distinction makes sense.
Oh.
I'm looking per dwelling. Okay, so you use the term net residential density, which is something that is rather common, and I'm just
we have it section 125-33, minimum lot size in all districts.
correct, except these are calculations that apply to whether or not a lot is just a legal lot that can have anything built on it. I'm looking to see whether you have, let's see, net residential density. Net residential acreage. So that's the homework that we're going to need to figure out, and I count myself among those who needs to do that particular piece of homework. I don't see anything. I don't see anything that specifically talks about minimum lot size per dwelling unit applicable in Owl's Head. And by Owl's Head, I mean Islesboro. You can tell that I was talking to Owl's Head about the exact same issues. So that is one thing that you're going to need to look at, because absent that being in your ordinance, it is the case that in these types of growth areas that are designated by the statute, you would need to allow more than one dwelling unit potentially to be built on a particular lot.
Is that the 20,000 square feet that the state statute refers to?
So this would be subject to that. So there is a state minimum lot size that effectively determines whether whether you're allowed to build any dwelling unit whatsoever. That's for septic purposes, but because you have an existing 1.5 acre lot size in order for anything to be buildable, I don't foresee that being as much of a problem. But conceivably, somebody with a 1.5 acre lot, unless I'm missing something in your ordinance, would be able, under LD 2003, in certain circumstances, to build multiple homes on that 1.5 acre lot.
I just, like I said, I had a conversation earlier this afternoon with Ben Averill and Hillary Grove from the DECD, and that was not what they said to me. At least that's not how I interpreted what they said to me. If you go to their guidance handout and you get the chart where the 1 house, 2 house, 3 house, 4 house thing is, they said, I had it in my hand pointing at the 1 house, 2 house, because I would love to be able to put 2 affordable houses on 1.5 acres. And they said no, that the 1.5 acres would still apply outside of the designated growth areas. That's what I was told.
Well, I think the 1.5, the way I read that is, and again, we've had good disagreements with DECD already on a couple of issues. Typically, the statute would require, if your ordinance required 1.5 acres per dwelling unit, and that was the language in your ordinance, then I agree with you completely. If it simply requires 1.5 acres for a lot to be developed, we could take that position, but I think that's a little bit. I think that's a little bit more of a gray area.
I love the semantics there. I like it.
I don't think it's ever been interpreted that way.
Right.
Okay, but it's interesting the way he's put it.
I did. I like it. Well, how does it read? Do we know what the actual language is? I don't have that.
I do. Just give me one quick moment.
Jennifer's looking it up.
Well, that's no, it just says it, if it takes 1.5 acres to be a buildable lot, then the 1 house, 2 house does apply.
That's why we need him. That's
Yeah.
that's for a lawyer to decide, not for us.
I'm all for
The
it.
interpretation.
Now I know I've looked at the statute so many times. So it's 4364A little 3. It says a municipal ordinance may not establish dimensional requirements or setback requirements for dwelling units allowed under this section that are greater than the dimensional or setback requirements for single family housing units, except that a municipal ordinance may establish requirements for lot area per dwelling unit, as long as the required lot area for subsequent units on a lot is not greater than the required lot area for the first unit. And so the distinction I'm making is most municipalities will have in their land use ordinances something to the effect of, you need 50,000 square feet for your lot to be a legal lot. Otherwise, you need to be a non-conforming lot of record. But that on top of that, you need X number of square feet of lot area per dwelling unit. And so, that goes into determining subdivision of, how many lots in a subdivision are available, whether someone could build a duplex instead of a single family on their lot. The thing I'm seeing, and again, I'll need to do a much closer inspection, your lot size requirement, there are, for instance, in chapter 45, under development review, you do have lot size per bedroom Although that may actually be square footage of each bedroom. This is only applying to hotels, motels, cabins, nursing homes. Their apartment buildings, so this is where the distinction would come in. So under 4538 for apartment houses, congregate dwelling houses, and the like, you do require 0.5 acres in lot area for each designated apartment. So that would be a restriction that would remain in place. The question is, and I don't believe that you have this in place. The question is whether you have a restriction like that applies to just the construction of multiple single-family houses on the same lot, or a duplex, triplex, et cetera. I think you do seem to have some restriction in 4538. I'm not certain that you have the same types of restrictions in 125, but I think that's on my list to report back to you for the next time that we talk about all of this.
If we were to consider a multi-unit dwelling, it would be in development review, not land use anyway.
Well, you have an interesting way of doing things because you have permitted and prohibited uses in land use. That's true, but then the review of those by the planning board is also subject to development review. That's correct. So there are different ways that we can implement these amendments, and I think I agree with you that there will probably need to be amendments in both of those particular parts of your code in order to make sure that all of this works correctly. So is there anything else that I can help with right now? It sounds as if I want to be as helpful to you as I possibly can be. I don't get the sense that even absent something from the legislature that we're anywhere close to being able to get these before town meeting before July 1, which is okay, but we'll need to work with your code officer come July 1 if there's no extension to sort of determine how he has to look at particular code issues. But in terms of going forward, it sounds like, I mean, it'd be very helpful from my standpoint to really know where on the island these growth areas are, so we can sort of plot out how to amend your ordinance accordingly. And then there are going to be some tweaks to your ADU section that are going to be necessary. And if you'd like me to, I'm happy to draft those and send them along, or as proposals before we meet again. I think it's in 2
Yeah, we were
weeks.
thinking that one might be the one that we could deal with right off the bat.
Easy.
And
Yep.
might have more attention from the community. And I guess, did you know in my thing that there was a comment about possibly adding a tiny house ordinance within our ordinance or section within the land use, just to include that somewhere as a separate entity from ADUs? If that makes sense.
Could you say that again?
The use of inserting into our ordinance, a tiny house ordinance.
So tiny houses are an interesting point. We can certainly look at doing that. What I would tell you is that there is another state statute on point in terms of tiny houses, and it does say that a municipality is required to permit the use of a tiny house as either a principal or an accessory dwelling unit, but only for land use purposes. So I don't know if your code officer is in the room. If they were, they would probably tell you that a tiny house creates all sorts of problems in terms of septic and electrical and other things that in terms of code compliance. But as a practical matter, if they met all other requirements of the ordinance, you would be required to permit a tiny home to be someone's principal residence. And if they already had a principal residence and they wanted to establish an accessory dwelling unit, they could use a tiny home to do that. So we can tweak something in the definition that just says, a tiny home is allowable or whatnot, but you don't necessarily need that in your ordinance to make it so, I think, if that makes sense.
Well, I think he just thought it would make his life easier if he had some guidance in the ordinance. So.
Sure.
That's why I brought it up.
That would be fine. I could also point him in the direction of the state statute that gives him all of that guidance too. But there's nothing wrong with being overly explicit.
Yeah,
I thought we could just add it to the definition.
yeah.
But
Yep.
it's a definition for small scale home occupation, and I thought maybe we could just add, ADU and tiny house to help describe small scale occupation.
Or just
No,
have a definition for tiny home.
There might
So
be
that's
specific dwelling.
confusing apples with oranges. Has nothing to do with occupations.
Small scale home occupation?
That has nothing to do with the ordinance in terms of what's allowable for an ADU or a tiny house or anything else. That's
So a small scale home occupation is it's typically a small home business.
Yeah.
They are operating out of your home. So that's a land use category. So, for instance, some people have they could be an accountant and they could work out of their home, or they could be a massage therapist or cut hair or do something like that. And towns want most times to allow that to happen, but with certain limits on it to make sure it's not disruptive. So I think that's what that refers to. But we can certainly build something in regarding tiny homes in your definition section, just to provide that clarification. That's not that shouldn't be too much of an issue.
But so what you're saying is for us that, well, in addition, you could draft something in terms of the ADUs.
Yep.
And what we need to do in terms of modifying the ordinance to adjust to them. And the other ones, we haven't really discussed the density, housing density in terms of our group. And we also have to deal with the comprehensive plan and growth areas, and that's stepping into a major issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, so,
But I think it's been very helpful for how you've described all three of these areas that we have to pay attention to. I have certainly a much better understanding of how we have to approach all of these. I think it's been very helpful.
yeah.
Well, I'm glad that's the intent here. And I have on my calendar the 25th at 5 o'clock. So that's 2 weeks from now. And, I can certainly early in that week, at the latest, I will circulate to Carrie, a proposed, it's going to be an amendment. I'm going to work within existing, chapter 125-35, which is accessory dwelling units, and just propose some amendments there, which I think will get you to where you need to be in terms of LD 2003. And then I think at that point, we can discuss more of how we're going to implement the additional density requirements.
I have another question about ADUs, from a parochial affordable housing initiative, corporation here. If you look at the Islesboro ordinances, several of them are fairly restrictive for us. I mean, I could probably, I can live with maybe the 2 bedrooms and the minimum size. If we wanted to keep that down to 800 square feet, I could build something smaller. But the thing that kills us is 125-35-3G, which says it has to be the owner has to occupy the primary residence. I specifically lobbied a speaker facto about allowing the primary resident owner to be a corporation, a nonprofit corporation, and he said, read the law, that's what it's gonna say. And that's what it doesn't, the law, as I understand it, and DECD's understand it, does not require that. But the ordinance here in Islesboro does. And does that, which one controls? Does the ordinance require, the Islesboro ordinance requiring primary occupant to be the owner? Does that still control? And if it does, can we change that for IAP? Because, you know, it really would help.
I believe it was pointed out to us that our ordinances may be considered not in compliance with the Fair Housing Act. And that we need to look at it in terms of that covenant requirement and the requirement that the owner be a resident in that house, that dwelling. So it sounds like there may be some issues that we need to just check.
I'm not aware of the fair housing angle. I can tell you that in this case, the ordinance does control in that aspect. It's not in the statute. The statute doesn't prohibit that type of restriction. And that type of restriction is actually pretty common across municipalities, with the thinking being that it's a way of preventing an accessory dwelling from being built and then just rented out as a short-term or long-term rental. I understand the counter argument perfectly well. That's a policy decision for the town of Islesboro to make. I think if you know, what I will do in my drafting is just to get you to the minimum of where you need to be. And anything beyond that, you know, the town, there's nothing that would prohibit the town from removing that restriction if it wanted to, but I think that's something the town meeting has to decide for itself.
Could the town make a carve out for a designated 501c3 affordable housing initiative? And that way, that, you know, because we're never gonna do what, you know, rent it out on a daily basis. We're only gonna do that.
It could be a new designated growth area.
Well, I'm just saying, if you just change the ADU ordinance for a carve out for a 501c3 corporation to do that, not be the primary resident, then IAP could put ADUs on these lots. And the biggest problem IAP is gonna have, has now and will have in the future, is property to develop. It's just hard to come by. And so if we could get a greater density somehow on the lots we already own, it would really help out with the development of affordable housing. That's my pitch.
Couldn't we, Rick says, couldn't we just have an exception for a 501c3, even designated the Islesboro Fair Housing Group? Couldn't that be part of our ordinance
Yes,
to go before town meeting?
there are certainly ways that you can do that. You know, you could either eliminate the restriction altogether or define, you know, you could put a caveat on that requirement. It says the owner is required to occupy, you know, and you could designate that for purposes of this restriction, an owner is defined to include a nonprofit, low income, you know, a nonprofit housing corporation. I mean, we want to be as specific as possible, right? To not open a door to unintended consequences. But I think that's something that you certainly could propose.
Yeah, I think the way you just worded it is ready to put into the ordinance.
I can propose language on that. That's fine. You know, again, I am just the, well, not the messenger, but I'm giving you something to work with. But ultimately, this is, and I will highlight that provision to let you know that this is something that is a take it or leave it. It's not a you must do this because the statute says so.
But our job is to recommend what this ordinance is, any changes to it, how they're gonna read. And our intent certainly with ADU is not to have people come in and put another small dwelling on there and rent out the whole property. So that's the intent of the state. We totally agree with that. But I think we would also agree that for the fair housing, you know, that the moderate income housing people, then that would be an appropriate thing to do for the town. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, so that, I think that would have to go to town meeting.
Oh, all of these, this whole thing has to go to town meeting, yeah.
Mhm.
But we could recommend that.
Certainly.
And we'd have to explain it at town meeting, sure.
So is there anything else I can do to be helpful in the meantime? I think what I sort of see my marching orders are for next time in 2 weeks is to get you a draft set of proposals for accessory dwelling units. And I will try and give you a definitive answer about what I think your ordinance does or doesn't say about minimum lot size per dwelling unit, so we can understand the ramifications of that.
Yep.
And then we can go from there.
Good.
Oh, another quick question. Our ordinance, and I think it's a state subdivision ordinance that 3 or more structures makes a subdivision. Do we have to deal with that potentially with the ADU? I guess you can only
An ADU is not considered.
one of each. It's a dwelling unit. It's 3 or more dwelling units.
Well, but you would have to have 3 or more ADU. I mean, in that situation, you would have to, you know, it would depend on the circumstances. It is true that under state subdivision law, the creation of 3 or more dwelling units in a 5-year period would trigger subdivision review. But the question, I guess, would be, what are you starting with? You know, if you had an existing duplex, for instance, and that duplex had been there for a number of years, presumably more than 5, the existing, you know, the addition of an ADU is not going to create a subdivision issue because of the time frame between those two. If you're proposing to build a triplex or a duplex with an ADU next to it, then yes, you probably would run into those concerns. But LD 2003 is explicit that it does not change state subdivision law at all. So your existing subdivision ordinance and state statute at that point are not changed, they're not affected.
Okay, thank you.
So can you clarify our homework? You would like a map with our designated growth? Or our town centers on that?
I would just like to, so you have an existing comprehensive plan, and I think that comprehensive plan identifies growth areas.
Okay.
And it would be helpful to see in some way, I guess let me talk about what we need it for. You need to allow affordable housing and other forms of increased density in those growth areas. And in order to do that in an ordinance, we're either going to need to be able to point to specific zones that exist already on your map, or more likely some sort of additional overlay zone that captures all of those growth areas. And so, yes, I mean, I think a map isn't 100% necessary at this point, but if you can do it and sort of plot those areas out and show it, you know, in a different color than everything else on your zoning map, something to that effect, that would be really helpful.
Even if we need to update our comprehensive plan to remove those, some of those, not all of them, just.
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to do a little bit more thinking about that, frankly, because again, the statute identifies growth areas, and I guess why don't we be overly inclusive at this point and show everything that's designated as a growth area in your comp plan, and then if you have concerns about particular areas of town that are in those growth areas because of X, Y, and Z, then we can discuss that and then tailor effectively. But I'd like to see sort of where we're starting with and then move from there.
Okay.
Just a quick thought, can we designate those growth areas by simply identifying the lots which are in those growth areas from our town map?
That is another way that you can do it. Some towns do in creating overlay zones. We won't necessarily show them on a map, but you know, in the ordinance language itself, it will say this overlay district applies to the following lots as shown on the town's tax maps. So if you can do it that way, if that's easier, then that's fine as well. We can do it one way or the other or both.
And
Yeah.
somewhere they have the Up Island ones, cause they were a map at one time.
But the island ones are not, we're not, it's
Yeah, but
not
it's-
part of this
Still
discussion.
in the comprehensive
Because-
plan, apparently.
Because the up island one was voted down.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you-
but it's
you
in the
want it
comprehensive
broad.
plan, so we should have it drawn out.
Ben is gonna have to advise us about that, whether we go back to the question we asked before. It's in the comprehensive plan, an up island area, but that area was voted down as part of the town meeting and ordinance. So what is the status of that area?
Well,
Is it,
when you describe voted down, can you give me a little bit more of idea of what we're talking about?
Can't remember.
Well, it was just an area at the north end of the island around
Two
the
different
store.
areas.
Was it 2 areas?
Up by the dam and by the store, that were
Oh.
being considered for a town center.
Um,
And those two were voted, they were either voted down or they were taken out of the vote because people up there didn't want it.
The Up
Okay.
Island people came to the meeting where that was under discussion in mass and said, we don't want it,
So it
and
just.
and it
got
was just taken out.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then it would be interesting to see and this is part of your homework, I suppose, is to what extent does the town center district, as it's sort of outlined on your existing map, and in your existing ordinance, to what extent does that overlap with what are identified as the growth areas in your comp plan? Because if your town center district is all of those growth areas, then I think we have a good argument of carving out the two, the couple of areas where the town decided that the town center zoning designation wasn't appropriate, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I need to, I need to see sort of what we're actually dealing with and sort of which areas of town and in what circumstances before we can move forward with that.
can you get that information to him?
Yeah, I'll come up with something.
Okay, or you can even take pictures of those maps and send them to.
Well, they must have, yeah,
We can get creative,
Might
for
have.
sure.
Well, we've got small ones. They're somewhere, or you can make. a
We
copy.
can.
Oh, we do.
Yeah, we do.
Thank you, Ben.
You're very
Yeah.
welcome. Thanks for having me. And I look forward to talking to you all again in 2 weeks.
All right, thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, take care.
Cheers.
Before you all disperse, man,
Yeah,
a lot of you while you're all here, I have no more knowledge than I did before about what's in the designated development area than I did when I walked in here, because I still didn't get the firm answer about what's gonna control, what's in the plan, nor the comprehensive plan, or what's on this board. They're different, but if in the course of your deliberations that you're gonna take to the town at some point, because there's an overlay or there's exact maps, it would really help the affordable housing initiative on this island. If these 3 lots right here, which are adjacent to the town center, got
Yeah.
included in that, because this 6 acres then could turn into a whole lot more development for IAP than the 4 that we can currently put on there.
I think all of Ruthie James should be in it.
Well, believe it or not, it was at the very initial, and like a moron, I asked them to take it out. Because a lot of these are not standard lots, and the people who own the houses don't own the land, and I didn't wanna get into somebody who had a 100-year lease trying to put an ADU on land they don't own, and I thought that was gonna turn into a nightmare, so I asked them to take it out. That's why Ruthie James is not in it.
I think you need to, who is this the select board? I don't
would
think
think
it's us.
I was just attending these meetings, like when the whole north end came in and said, no, we don't want it.
Yeah.
I told them, and actually, I might have said it to Janet, whoever was the town manager, I think it was Janet, to take them out, because I thought that was gonna get to be a legal nightmare.
Understand.
But this land is all owned, was donated by Mark Schnurr,
And we're getting ready to develop we're starting in July to develop these houses. But if I could get that included in the development zone, then a lot of my problems go away on trying to put more than 4 houses on that.
What, I don't know if I'm right about this, but I think you need to go to the select board.
I don't know how we petition to have that area extended. We'd have to have it approved. I know there is an error on the map where the town property is. They put the line around the resource protection zone and it should have gone to the lot line. Because the definition of a resource protection zone, you do not use the map. It's for information that you have potential problems, but you go on the site and determine, is there buildable land here? And that is why the health center is being built in that area.
I mean, I think everybody wants affordable housing, so it just needs to go to the.
Yeah,
People
I'm
to
looking
get it
for,
done.
I spent a week reading through all that stuff you guys gave me last time, and then I still didn't understand it, so started sending emails back and forth at DECD, and I still didn't understand it, so I got myself an appointment with Ben and Hillary, and I sat down with them for an hour and a half, and they basically said that none of the stuff I wanna do was gonna fly. So that's what, because that property is not currently in a designated growth area. It's not on a public sewer and water, none of these things that allow all this density increase work for IAP. And I'm like, man, if a 33-year-old organization whose sole purpose is to create affordable housing, and this does nothing for us in its current state.
You need to get that changed.
Well, it might be able to be part of this whole process.
Mm.
And that's a mindset.
If you're gonna have to go to the town anyway,
Yeah.
stick those 3 lots in there for me, will ya?
Just back off a minute. What I understand part of Ben's homework is gonna be, with your help, is to look at these maps and give us an opinion about whether they are designated growth areas. If they are, that would be great, and then what we have to do is add that to them in this process.
Yeah, and I would be real interested if I was sitting in your chairs about the language about is 1.5 acres required for a dwelling unit, or is 1.5 acres a buildable lot? Because if it's just 1.5 acres is a buildable lot, you just double the density on every lot on this island, according to what I heard.
I mean, there's been